Well, let's first just quick down the line who you are, what firm you're from, and then we'll jump in right away.
My name is Joshua Pino. I am managing partner at Jump Cannon.
I'm Parker Thompson. I'm a partner at AngelList.
Christine Herron. I'm from Intel Capital, and I manage the Diversity Fund.
Monique Woodard, venture partner at 500 Startups.
Claire Lee, head of early stage at Silicon Valley Bank.
Awesome. Okay, so we kind of broke the ice with Alan Powell on stage. There's definitely some issues in venture capital, and most of us know what those are. So the panel is called "What the fuck is happening in venture capital?" Let's talk about it. What's happening in venture capital? And just jump in. It's just a discussion together.
I think it's more about what's happening in the world. Of course, we're here to talk about venture capital in particular, but you can look at from Hollywood to venture capital to other areas of finance to just business in general. I think there's, I think it's easy to focus on the negative, but let's look at the positive side. There is this awakening that's happening, and women are finding their voices and being able to speak out about things that we've all seen in the industry for decades.
Right.
And so I think that is the positive flip side of what's happening. The negative is that it's been happening for decades, right? And so that is really what the fuck is happening in the world.
Yeah, and people...
And venture capital is part of that.
And people talk about how it's changed so much and it's become so much more modern thinking. My first venture capital job was in 1992. And at that time, there were maybe 4% female partners. And at least the last time I checked a year or so ago, it was still 4% female partners.
Yeah.
So, you can talk about how venture as a workplace or as an industry has become more open-minded, has become more inclusive, but, really it has not.
Yeah.
So I think as well we've seen a lot more data and a lot of honest conversation around some of the, for instance, the economics of representation. And as you know, I don't like the D word because I think diversity tends to mean different, and different means different. But in fact, inclusion and representation has been proven to at least, drive good returns. So more better returns if you have a diverse team, if you have, diversity in thinking, but more importantly, if you have representation. So I think the more, people, basically I think about sources of capital, right? The more people with money who are making decisions about how to place that capital are obviously going to be, more representative and inclusive in their thinking. I think they need to have, more of a global perspective, which we're definitely seeing. They're taking more notice of the data for sure, and they're not able to really, ignore the economics of this anymore. So I think that's another interesting thing because, really when it comes down to venture capital, it is capital, with venture, right? It's not adventure capital, it's venture capital. So it's really looking at how do you help people really understand that, doing well and doing good is actually the same, right? You're going to do really well from these investments if you are able to, think globally and think more inclusively and understand the economics of representation. And I think that's something that has shifted a great deal in the last 5-6 years for me.
Awesome. Parker and Joshua, being good allies, you let the women speak first. I love it. And you are some of the biggest allies in venture capital and really appreciate it. What, from your perspective, what's happening?
What's happening is exactly what was just articulated. So the question then is, what do we do about it? And I don't have as much faith in my gender as some do. Parker wonderfully aside. Present company very much excluded. That we can take what's happening and start practicing some mindfulness and self-awareness and doing the work. The thing that's going to shift, the thing that we can do, is shifting our resources, obviously, to not only inclusive entrepreneurs, but in creating new firms that are made up of the representation we want to see. That's what's going to happen. I think the only thing that's going to substantially shift the industry is economic returns. There is no incentive on the part of traditional venture capital to start changing things because they've made such a substantial amount of money up until now. And that's their business, right? As much as we might want, we might want the mindfulness to take place. We might want more meetings with women, people of color, LGBTQ folks. I don't want to put individuals through that process while we're expecting men to do the work. So I know that's a little bit of a harder line, but I feel like right now, we're making space for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ folks to come forward with their narratives, and we need to respect that and then ask let's put some resources behind them.
So, I mean, I think Monique nailed it, saying, look, like what's happening is just what's always been happening. And so to me, I think where we're at today, like some days I'm pessimistic, but most days I'm optimistic. I think you can kind of be both, right? Because I think what I see going on is many new firms coming up. This seed stage has really been interesting in terms of people being able to start firms, not just join them. I think you're seeing at big firms conversations happening about how you build a more diverse set of partners, how you compete in this new world, and I think we could sort of fairly criticize some of the results there, but conversations are happening. Even the people who aren't woke, so to speak, at least are confused. And that's better than being oblivious, right? Like, what is going on? I don't understand.
Hopefully they don't stay confused.
I think confused is better than oblivious, right?
Curious.
So I think overall I'm somewhat optimistic.
So,
But I do have a pessimistic side of what you just said. A lot of underrepresented VCs, Black, Latinx, women VCs, are starting their own funds because they can't get ahead in existing funds.
Good point.
And it's sort of this existing Sand Hill Road structure, right? So they're going out and starting these funds and having a difficult time raising money, not raising as big of funds as their counterparts. And I think that's not good either.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be representation at the micro VC level for women, people of color. There also needs to be representation internal in these other, often later stage, much bigger funds with women, people of color, LGBTQ people as well. So I think the pessimistic view of that is that, look, we're starting these funds because we can't do it any other way.
But that's
But
pretty
that's
standard,
life.
right?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, if you look at the firms that do have, meaningful or, equal, dare I say it, representation, I mean, they're ones that were founded with women, right? It's Scale and it's Forerunner and firms like that. It's not Sequoia or Benchmark or Excel. So, and some of these folks that are coming along and doing like their smaller ones, the $3 million fund, that's fine. Those funds will grow over time. But I think we're going to have to wait for those firms to grow and to go from the $3 million funds to the $10 million funds to the 50 to the 100 before you do get that movement. It's not going to happen. And it's true of any firm just in general, right? You have some group of folks that are the founding partners, and until they retire, they're not getting out of their chairs.
Yeah.
So just by default, that firm is not going to get that diverse.
And these firms just have these baked-in cultures. So I think a lot of them are trying to check the box. Often it's like, we're looking for a female partner.
As if that just fixes it.
I talked to a founder that I know pretty well. He said, "Oh, X firm that invested in me is hiring a female partner." I said, "Oh, they are? Who is it?" "Well, no, they're looking for one, right? They've got a chair open and they want to fill it with somebody who happens to be a woman." They're like, "Okay, well, I'm skeptical of that mentality. So if I were that woman, I'd be like, well, what am I walking into? And am I going to be an equal here, or am I walking into a 20-year-old plus culture that I'm sort of set up for failure in?" So I don't know. I think you can be pessimistic about sort of this, but you can also look at it and say, if you were one of these people, you might just be better off starting your own firm, because at least you own it.
Enabled for success.
So I see that a lot, and I think, I was known as an opinionated optimist. I may have updated that to pragmatic optimist, right? But I think here's the things that we're seeing, and I have an office on Sand Hill Road, so I can kind of vouch for some of this, vibe. But I'll tell you why I remain a pragmatic optimist, and that is that every day I see breakout funds, new funds, emerging managers. I mean, the unprecedented degree of activity with people starting something. Two, there is a generational difference, right? I'll tell you, I'm kind of here, and I won't tell you what age I am, but you can probably guess that it's like I'm not in my 30s anymore, right? So I kind of tend to straddle a couple of generations in that space, right? And what's super interesting, I'll tell you, as an example, went to LA, Jeffrey Katzenberg's new fund, right? They've carved out a bunch of money, in there for seed investment run by Anthony. Anthony's friggin' awesome. Anthony does not seek, normal investments. He's going to go out and have this different lens. He's a young black male in LA, and he's amazing, right? And he's just, he's one of many. Sheil Tile left NEA, started Amplo. Guess what? He flew to DC to see a certain friend of mine who used to be part of the Obama administration. In fact, was the national security advisor, and they had a conversation. Now, where else would that occur, right? So I'm standing in a space where I get to witness this kind of great stuff every day, where this generation meets this generation, and guess what? They're not defined by the boundaries and the kind of stuff that I think generations before may have decided were part of the construct. They're in fact creating everything on their own terms. They are doing deals on their own terms. And they, to your point, Parker, I call it the smell of sincerity. It's like you can sense at 20 paces if it's bullshit, tick box, you're just doing D&I, and they'll run away and just say, this is bullshit. And they will call you on that. And I think it's really interesting to see this wave of, and again, it's about capital, right? So if these people are controlling capital, they will direct it to the things that we all care about and we want to see happening and mainstreamed. So I personally don't think it's a bad thing. I mean, look at the latest person to join Kleiner as a partner, right? I mean, again, there's just lots and lots and lots of crappy stories and bad news, and God knows I have to stop doing Twitter at midnight because I never sleep when I do that. But you know what? The next day, there's always something else to counter it. And 2 or 3 examples like that where, I'm so immersed in that kind of stuff that I cannot possibly become pessimistic about it.
So in the same way that underrepresented people are starting to start their own funds, a lot of underrepresented people are not thriving in tech companies and starting their own tech companies. And I believe, and I want to check in with you, that not all of those startups fit the normal venture capital system, that we need to find some new funding models and some new ways of supporting those underrepresented entrepreneurs. What do you all think? And Joshua, maybe you can start since you just started working on that.
Well, so I think it's a very fair point. We talk about seed stage and we talk about all these different stages, which the Valley has a general definition of however much seed stage might be evolving with seed prime and all of this new nomenclature that's popping up nowadays. When you look at founders from underrepresented backgrounds, the unit economics are completely different. When the average black woman who's gone to an Ivy League school can only raise $35,000 in venture funding, quote unquote. I mean, that compared to 1.4 million from her white counterpart, that is just you have to get real about what we're actually talking about. Yeah. That's not seed. You can't even call that friends and family at that level. Yeah. So you by fundamentally, if you're going to focus on these founders, you have to rethink the unit economics and start understanding what are these founders' actual capitalization needs, what are the resources beyond just capital, and rethink how does this trajectory, how does the growth of this company look, and even if you're just a software company, if you are technology, the system doesn't support it just yet. So there's a broader conversation in venture capital right now around unicorn being for unicorn's sake. What's wrong with simply being a $500 million company? We should have those conversations. I think underrepresented founders present an opportunity to rethink models in a unique way, and I'll let you guys kind of jump in on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. Like, you do see this problem where, you know, if it takes a certain set of people longer to raise money and they raise less money, it's easy to look at those people and another set of people and say, well, see, this pool of people gets to Series A more quickly or more often, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I do think there is a problem, but that's also an opportunity, right? If you see, I mean, these companies are often, you know, it's easier to invest in them, the founders work harder, the valuations are lower, and so if you can get them to a point where they just look like companies, I mean, I actually tend to think that if you can get a company to $10 million of revenue, it's not that hard to get something funded at Series A if it's a good company that happens to have founders that look a little bit different. So we're looking at spreadsheets, we're looking at numbers, whereas I think at the beginning when you're raising 35K and I'm raising 3 million, it's ideas, and you have to imagine this person as a billion-dollar CEO, and so if you have biases baked in there, those biases show through, versus if I'm looking at your spreadsheets, it makes it a little bit easier to say, well, proof by existence, you as a founder who happens to look different than this founder that I normally think of the pattern, built $10 million of revenue, and actually it's a really interesting business. So I think I'm really focused on that $0 to $2 million raise, because I think that's where the leverage is here.
And if
But I don't know that we need a different investment structure for that stage. I think the problem is, you know, again, just more endemic to who's on the team. So if you look at composition of venture firms, you know, by gender or ethnicity, there's definitely a relationship in between the diversity of the firm and the investments they make. There's also a difference in the success of those diverse team investments. So if you have a venture team that has women on it, the women founders they back will do better. You know, and that makes sense to me. You know, when I was at Omidyar Network, we had a similar situation where we had 40% of the investment team was female. Just happened to be that way when you're coming from philanthropy. You know, you have more women, and so you know, you sort of seeded with a lot of women. And through nothing intentional, we had a group of portfolio companies that were also 40% women. Go figure. and they did, you know, sort of comparably well to the companies that were male founded. And again, we didn't do anything differently, but the male investors inside our organization were used to working with women. So the things that we did that would have created friction by the time they were working with a female CEO, they were used to that. You know, they didn't feel like it was friction anymore. It was just, they were comfortable with that working style. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions about diversity in general, or hiring that female partner, is that you look for diversity and culture fit. And if you think that you can get both at the same time, you don't get it. You absolutely do not get inclusion if you think that you hire that person and it's a perfect culture fit. There's going to be friction, and the work you do to sort of work through that friction is why you get better products. It's why you make better investments. It's from the friction. And people don't want friction. It's not as easy. It doesn't feel as good. So, you know, they want their candy.
If I may, actually, that's the exact argument of why you should invest in underrepresented founders, right? To both of your points, if you're looking at least in the seed stage, when there isn't any traction, right? You just have a person with an idea, right? You have to bet on the team, and when you have a team in front of you that's had to work twice as hard for half as much, who brings grit to the table day one, who understands vulnerability, who can say, "I'm having trouble with this. Can you help me?" I mean, that's a phrase you just don't hear in the Valley, and we have apps that try to get people to ask that question nowadays. So it's risk mitigation on the part of an investor. It's powerful risk mitigation, especially if you're in seed investing. And then you're able to optimize for the culture fit, right? Then you're able to build that day one.
Monique, you have been raising a fund for underrepresented entrepreneurs, and how does that look different than other funds at 500, and just in terms of creating that fund and raising, and what does that look like?
So, so I think when I think about, you know, what the fund really is, and I think a lot of people can't get over the underrepresented founder part to get to the changing U.S. demographics part. And that's the part that's actually really exciting to me, is that the U.S. demographics are changing. People of color are going to be the majority by the year 2044, and that and there are differences in the way we consume technology. There are differences in consumer trends and consumer behavior. And that makes a really interesting market. So for me, it's really a market opportunity rather than just simply a founder opportunity. And the founders are best positioned to take advantage of that market. So I think the challenge in raising that sort of fund is that people see Black and Latino markets and think diversity rather than thinking
Economic return.
economic return and there's money here.
Now, is
right?
that the LP response? Like, how do LPs respond
Right,
to that?
that is the LP response. And typically going out to the typical 500 LPs, they're often not U.S. based, often many corporates who are often in countries outside of the U.S. And so that story is a little bit difficult to tell. So it's certainly a lot of cultivating my own LP base and cultivating people who will understand that. And that's a really difficult road to run down. Yeah.
At
so
the same time,
I think all fundraising is hard. Like, I won't sit up here and tell you all, who many of you know, like, as a founder, fundraising is hard. As an underrepresented founder, fundraising is certainly very hard. As a VC, fundraising is hard. As an underrepresented VC, especially hard. So all fundraising is incredibly difficult. Sometimes with a thesis that people don't understand, it can be even more difficult. Sorry, Claire.
I think it is hard. It's getting harder, by the way. I mean, we see the data on, raising seed capital, raising Series A. It's definitely getting harder. So in that environment, actually, what I've noticed again this year, and it's probably anecdotal, I don't actually track data by gender in our portfolio companies, and we run, a portfolio of thousands and thousands of companies. But again, back to this global perspective, I honestly feel like entrepreneurship transcends borders now, and thank God business transcends politics, because that would be bad if it wasn't the case. So, when you put a lot of this together, there's so much momentum. And I'll tell you again, another kind of salient example where November 8th, I was actually invited to do something in New York with a family I absolutely adore, and I can't be there because I looked at my calendar and it says November 8th, you have to be here and do this LP day. And I'm like, why am I doing that? I looked at it and I said, is this LP day all about diversity and inclusion? They said, yeah. The entire day is like State Street, SVB, whatever. This is unprecedented. I have never seen a whole day devoted to having LPs and GPs in a room. And of course, I'm using the opportunity to invite people who are fundraising, you gotta come, to meet those LPs. And it's what I call, curated, like facilitated serendipity, right? So I feel if you do that, you're exposing more of the people, again, with the money, the capital, who are, and I have to admit, reaching out proactively to people like me saying, I am interested in. I've never heard it before. Until this year, I had never got an email from, serious LPs who've been doing what they do successfully for years. They don't have to kind of color outside the lines, right? They're kind of coming now going, I want to do X. And you're like, holy shit, great. Yeah, I can find you females who are fundraising. Of course I can find you those people. Look at the list of people we have. It's amazing. So again, I know it's kind of, maybe a little bit too late, but it's like, it's good, right? I never had those kind of emails before. I never had days on my calendar blocked to talk about the difficult stuff that makes, quite frankly, a lot of bankers and people like us, LPs, kind of uncomfortable. So at least we're going there now. And I'm very pleased to be part of that and give up my day.
Christine, Intel did something fairly unique in creating the fund. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like to kind of come from that corporate perspective and really look at this issue?
So, and just the quick context. So, Intel Capital has a $125 million set aside for a diversity initiative. And that was announced about 2.5 years ago. We originally were focusing on women and underrepresented minorities. And we had a few folks set up to, make investments, in those teams. And that was announced alongside a $300 million initiative for employees, both on recruiting and retention, because inclusion and retention kind of do this, have some issues. So that was 2.5 years ago. Made some investments. About a year and a half ago, we said, okay, like, what are some of the lessons? What's been working? What's not working? And we realized that if we really wanted to move the needle in what we were doing, a couple of things needed to change. Number one, having this little silo, like, oh, yay, we've invested in you, like, hop in the diversity bucket. That doesn't make any sense. That female IoT founder doesn't want to be in the diversity bucket. She wants to be in the IoT bucket.
Right, yeah.
Right, so we said, okay, so number one, we're going to get rid of the little vertical silo, and this is going to be a horizontal platform. And so now there are both guidelines and incentives for all 50 investors at Intel Capital to look for diverse teams, to get the top of their deal funnel to be broader. And so ideally come out with better deals at the bottom. So that was the first change. And then the other one was to look at what's happening with our existing portfolio. Our current active portfolio is about 400 companies. Over time, we've invested in around 1,500 companies, sort of historically. And if I have $125 million to invest in diverse teams, that's not nearly as much as if, okay, over 5 years, but we invest $400 million a year. So I would like to take some percentage of those 400 active companies, and can we have the ones that are still growing and hiring senior management? Can we get them to grow in a more inclusive way? Can we get them to be looking at more diverse candidates when they're hiring their new VP marketing or the VP engineering that's going to work with the CTO and so forth? And that's made a big difference as well, because now I have folks in those firms coming to us and saying, hey, I'm looking for diverse candidates for this, I can't find one, or I'm worried that I'm going to lose my awesome female COO. Can you help me with that? And so it's a different set of service orientation to develop inside all of the investors, because it's not something that all of our investors are used to talking about with their CEOs, for sure. So we made those changes. We also opened up the scope, because we sat down and said, well, what do we recognize as a diverse as parts of a diverse population inside of Intel? And so I said a year and a half ago when we made these changes, I looked around, I was like, wow, we have employee resource groups for LGBTQ. We have employee resource groups for military veterans and for people with disabilities. Why are they not part of the fund? Because I know I actually have never seen, since 1992, I've never seen an entrepreneur come in a wheelchair to pitch for funding, like ever. Right? You very rarely have someone proud of their military service. A lot of folks sort of like downplay it because they worry that it means they just want to follow orders, which is not true at all. So we took those and we made those part of what we want to have a welcome mat out on. It's like, what are the different types of diversity that we need to celebrate, that we need to make sure are becoming better represented in this environment. So that's sort of where we came from. And where we are right now. We've got, the first year we launched it, about 6% of our investing was diverse, which is kind of average for the industry. Last year, we were at 15% of our investing diverse. This year, we're tracking at 20%, just over 20%, which is really fantastic. And the other metric, which is interesting, is looking at, the larger percentage of Intel Capital's active portfolio, how much of that is diverse. And I think that's getting announced tomorrow, but I won't say it because we have another event tomorrow. But it's a good number. It's like we hit double digits. Very exciting. So yeah, so there's some good movement happening.
Awesome. And so Parker, you're at AngelList. You're kind of able to see the big picture. Do you feel like we're at a tipping point of change? Do you feel like we're actually there in terms of really shifting toward a more inclusive environment in venture capital and investing in more underrepresented entrepreneurs?
It's a good question. I don't know that I see it in the data. You see companies, right, and you notice them because they stand out, which is not necessarily a good thing, right? So I'm not sure that it's in the data yet, but I think when you talk to the investors that are out there at the early stage, which is very much my world, right? I think that these are the things that people are talking about. And I sort of started by saying I feel optimistic. And I think the reason I'm optimistic is, there are these conversations happening, and it's not done. We're not done, but there's a moment where when you want to push on these things, people are receptive. And so I think now is a good time to both push, but also just go start these companies, go raise this money, like go do these things. Like now is a moment where people are sort of like open to looking at a founder and going like, oh, I've been reading about bias. Let me go talk to a founder that maybe looks a little bit different and reflect on my own biases, which is how you push through them. So I think that's a positive thing, and the sort of the challenge is to not get tired, right? To just keep going.
Yeah, right.
Easier said than done.
Take your vitamins. Yeah.
And with that, we're out of time. So I wanted to thank you all for continuing to push the industry forward. Don't get tired. Take care of yourself. Keep going. And together, let's change this thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.